welcome to our panel discussion of a couple of key works that Dr. William Lane Craig, has been doing. This one looks at his, in the preferred title, it should be his anti-Platonism in relation to his work on the penal substitutionary theory of atonement. There are three of us who will be participating in this panel. I am Dr. Scott Smith. I'm at Biola University in Talbot School of Theology, professor of Christian apologetics, in that program, the MA program. Rich Davis is professor of philosophy at Tyndale in Toronto. And then we have Dr. William Lane Craig with us, who's research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, as well as Houston Baptist University. So I think we're going to start with Rich Davis and his paper, and then I'll read mine, and then Dr. Craig will read his response. Or, well, we'll present our responses.
Okay, here we go.
Well, greetings. I want to begin by saying how privileged I feel to be commenting on Bill Craig's work on God and abstract objects as it relates to the atonement. I also want to express some gratitude to Bill for having come to the University of Alberta in 1986, where I was undergraduate in zoology. Bill debated a member of the philosophy department there, and I was a brand new Christian, and I was in the audience, and I can remember thinking to myself, I haven't got a clue of what's being discussed here, but I feel very strengthened in my faith and encouraged, so much so that my life took an entirely different direction from that point onwards. In fact, I think it's true to say that if Bill had not come to the University of Alberta in 1986 for that debate, I wouldn't now be offering this commentary. So a true counterfactual of freedom.
Amen.
The paper is entitled Arguing for Atonement. If you want to follow along with it online, it's at richbdavis.com/blog/EPS. So, arguing for atonement. According to one sort of nominalist, Bill Craig prefers the term anti-realist, there are no mathematical or logical objects. No numbers, propositions, possible worlds, properties, or relations. Everything whatsoever is a concrete object, either a substance or a trope. Call that position noma, no mathematical objects. Now, I have a good deal of sympathy for this view, especially for the theological reasons Bill sets out related to divine aseity. Still, whether noma will ultimately carry the day with classical theists may well depend on how the details get filled in. So here's one area where I think it would be good to hear a bit more. In his work on penal substitution, Bill has advanced dozens of arguments, some of which at least are to be understood as deductively valid. For example, consider the satisfaction argument. In Bill's mind, a persuasive argument for the conviction of Anselm and the reformers that the satisfaction of divine justice is a necessary condition of salvation. That argument unfolds in a series of stages as follows. 1, necessarily retributive justice is essential to God. 2, necessarily, if retributive justice is essential to God, then God justly punishes every sin. 3, necessarily, if God justly punishes every sin, then divine justice is satisfied. 4, therefore, necessarily divine justice is satisfied. And then 5, therefore, necessarily, if some human beings are saved, divine justice is satisfied. Now, 1 through 3 are the premises. From the 3 premises, Bill says, 4 follows. Divine justice is satisfied so long as no sin goes unpunished. To which I can only reply, yea and amen. Of course, by follows here, Bill means logically follows or is entailed by. In fact, the argument from 1 through 3 to 4 is deductively valid. being an instance of modus ponens twice over. Also valid is the inference of 5 from 4. Thus, Bill comments, 5 in turn follows. Since any proposition implies a necessary truth, it also follows that if divine justice is not satisfied, then no human beings are saved. Indeed, that it is impossible that any human beings are saved. The notion of implication or entailment at work here is, of course, strict. A proposition P strictly implies a proposition Q, just in case it's impossible that P is true and Q is false. Of course, as Q is a necessary truth, for example, the law of excluded middle, then not Q will be a necessary falsehood, in which case the conjunction of any proposition P with not Q will be impossible. That is to say, any proposition P strictly implies any necessary truth. And this is, of course, one of Lewis's, and here I'm speaking of Clarence Irving and not Clive Staples, one of Lewis's infamous paradoxes of strict implication. Okay, part 1, the world according to Noma. Now, as we all learned at our mother's knee, a valid argument is one in which the premises entail or strictly imply the conclusion. A valid argument is such that necessarily its premises are true, its conclusion is also true. And then given the truth of those premises, we can go on to say that the argument is not only valid, but sound. Presumably then, a deductive proof will be a sound argument. It may well be more than that, but it won't be anything less than that. So let's ask whether the premises of the satisfaction argument are true when viewed under the lens of Noma. A prior question, what sort of thing is a premise? Well, on the canonical conception, premises are taken to be propositions, claims or assertions that represent things as being this way or that. True if they get things right and false if they don't. They can be believed or disbelieved. When, for example, I believe that retributive justice is essential to God, I don't believe that string of ink marks. I believe the content of what is inscribed on page 94 of my copy of Bill's book, which I've placed there on the screen. I believe the propositional truths communicated by that sequence of shapes highlighted in yellow. Propositions then are not identical with the sentences, utterances, or inscriptions used to express them. Indeed, if planning is right, they're not identical with concrete objects of any kind. On the canonical conception, rather, they're abstract or at least non-linguistic entities. According to Bill's Noma view, however, not only are there no propositions in this sense, but there are no properties either. Therefore, there really isn't such an entity as truth. But that implies, given the canonical conception, that there are no true propositions. Indeed, the dialectical situation is far more grim. For if premises and conclusions are best construed as propositions, and there are no propositions, then the satisfaction argument doesn't even exist. And so much then for arguing on behalf of penal substitution with an argument that doesn't even exist. Not surprisingly, Bill has an answer to this line of criticism. He maintains that there's no good reason to believe that there are any abstract objects. For the principal argument in their favor, the so-called indispensability argument, is an abject failure, quote, a piece of philosophical imperialism, end quote. There's no need to descend into the mind-numbing details here, and indeed they are mind-numbing. Bill's point is that contrary to initial appearances, our assertively uttering or inscribing sentences containing singular terms, for example, the number 9 is odd, or existentially quantified sentences, for example, there are numbers greater than 9, is by no means ontologically committed. There need be no reference for the singular terms used, or a real world of objects in the domain over which we're quantifying. Talk of numbers, propositions, properties, and the like is simply a façon de parler. We may regard it, if we want, as metaphorical, figuralism, or make-believe, pretense theory, or just plain false, fictionalism. Now, two initial comments. Number one, it's worth noting that indispensability arguments don't fail across the board, even if they fail in the case of abstract objects. For example, these instances of the general form of the argument appear to be perfectly in order. 6, there are literally true existential sentences. 7, if 6, then there are sentences. So 8, sentences exist. Or again, 9, this sentence is a concrete object. 10, if 9, then there are concrete objects. So 11, concrete objects exist. My assertively uttering or inscribing 6 or 9 in this case does indeed involve an ontological commitment on my part, doesn't it? I commit myself to the real existence of the very concrete sentences I find myself having just uttered or inscribed. Number 2, as Bill lays things out, for the classical theist at least, the indispensability argument for abstract objects fails primarily because he, that is the classical theist, already knows there aren't any such things. Or if there were, God would depend on them in crucial ways. And then given that aseity is an essential attribute of deity, it would follow that God didn't even exist. Well, fair enough, but believing in premises isn't a matter of metaphor, fiction, or make-believe. There are premises in a metaphysically heavyweight sense. For example, there are the premises figuring in Bill's satisfaction argument. If they're not abstract entities, then what are they? Further, if we don't believe they're substantially true, there being no such property, what is it that recommends them to us? Surely the premises of a proof, or even just a good argument, must have some positive alethic status. Now, if I understand Bill here, he doesn't mean to deny that there are premises or conclusions. Of course not. What he denies is that these are abstract, uncreated truth bearers. Instead, the anti-Platonist can happily admit the existence of sentences as truth bearers, for these are clearly created, concrete objects. Happily, I don't know, for if sentences are tokens, won't there be types of which they're tokens? A token without a type is like an effect without a cause. It's hard to make sense of it at best. Arguably, however, sentence types are abstract patterns or forms. And that's just what the proponent of NOMA was hoping to avoid. I also don't think Bill wants to deny there's a sense in which premises and conclusions can be true. To be sure, as a deflationary nominalist, he rejects the ideas that the terms true and false predicate a substantial abstract truth property of a sentence. But that's easily avoided, he says, for we can descend, if we like, from talk of premises being true to simply asserting them. We'd only drop the alethic add-on is true. You just drop that as you descend. Instead of saying of a sentence token S, it's true, we just declare S and leave it at that. But unless we already know there aren't any properties, this move is bound to strike the realist as little more than a piece of semantic imperialism. The question is, how does it do away with truth simpliciter altogether? In fact, it doesn't. In the first place, notice that when we make our semantic descent, we don't conclude by merely affirming the sentence or premise in question. Quote, says Bill, rather than talk about truth, we can descend semantically and truly affirm it, end quote. So in that case, we haven't really stopped talking about truth, have we? We've only shifted from speaking of it on one level, a true sentence token, to speaking of it on another level, a true affirmation of that token. Secondly, Bill tells us explicitly that his descent deflationism is compatible with truth as correspondence. For, quote, statements directly asserted, and I'm taking it here that in offering the satisfaction argument, Bill is directly asserting 1 through 5. Statements directly asserted are descriptive of the world as it actually is. But there's a proviso. Correspondence must be cashed out holistically in terms of whole sentences, not just atomistic units inside sentences, whole sentences. Correspondence may be taken, he says, to obtain between a sentence as a whole and the world. Such holistic correspondence is expressed by Tarski biconditionals. A deflationary view of truth need understand no more by the notion of truth as correspondence than that S is true if and only if S. That is all there is to truth as correspondence. Here I believe there's good news mixed with bad. The good news is that on this view, we can say of the sentences comprising the satisfaction argument, they correspond with reality. And that's a good thing. After all, what kind of argument would it be if X hypothesi, its premises, failed to describe the world correctly? The bad news is that the Tarski biconditionals are really not all there is to truth as correspondence. And coupled with NOMA, this fact makes trouble for the argument's soundness. Perhaps we can see this as false. So this is now part 2, objections. I'm going to look first at the premises and then at the validity of the argument. So part 2, objections. Consider first the first premise of the satisfaction argument. 1, necessarily retributive justice is essential to God. This premise is a compound sentence comprised of a simple sentence, that is to say the material inside the bracket in dark blue, prefixed by a modal operator, necessarily. Further, necessity, by all accounts, is an alethic modality. It's a mode of truth. If that's right, then given that truth is correspondence, 1 implies 1 star. Necessarily, the sentence token, retributive justice is essential to God, is true. That is, corresponds with reality. However, there's something more to correspondence than just removing some quotation marks. The sequence of shapes inside those quotes must state what is the case. It must describe the world as it actually is. And here Bill concurs. Quote, a statement S is true, he says, if and only if what S states is the case. So that means we can sharpen 1 star to read 1 double star. Necessarily, the sentence token retributive justice is essential to God corresponds to the state of affairs, which, as things in fact stand, it states to be the case. Retributive justice is essential to God. All that remains then is to decide what is meant here by necessarily. Bill doesn't have a full-blown theory of modality. However, he does tell us how to read a statement such as necessarily 2 + 2 = 4. There is no trouble, he says, understanding what this simple sentence means. For example, that 2 + 2 could not but be 4. So that means we can take 1 double star as 1 triple star. And here I promise no more stars, that's it. 1 triple star. The sentence token, retributive justice is essential to God, could not fail to correspond to the state of affairs, which, as things in fact stand, it states to be the case. Namely, retributive justice is essential to God. Unfortunately, this view of premise 1, under the lens of NOMA, as it were, has several unhappy results. Note first that if 1 implies 1 triple star and 1 triple star is false, then so is the argument's first premise. And strictly speaking, it seems to me that 1 triple star is false. The series of marks, retributive justice is essential to God, or R for short, could very well have failed to correspond to the actual state of affairs, retributive justice is essential to God. It could have failed to correspond, for example, by failing to exist. Sentences, after all, are concrete and contingent. Unlike God, they don't exist by a necessity of their own nature. Well, you might object that by could not fail to correspond, we don't mean fail to correspond simpliciter. We mean only that R couldn't both exist and fail to correspond. But this suggestion doesn't really help. The problem fundamentally is that a series of marks like R doesn't in itself describe anything. It doesn't state what is the case. Hence, it doesn't in itself correspond with reality. Individual words, for example, proper names, don't refer just by virtue of their being words. Rather, on Bill's view, quote, it's persons who refer to things by means of their words, so that words at best refer only in a derivative sense, if at all, end quote. Well, it seems to me that the same might be said for sentences as a whole. A sentence like R states what is the case, but only if there are speakers or writers who thus use it. But if so, R could certainly fail to exist, but fail to correspond. Think, for example, of a world in which R exists, but there are no language users. In such a world, R simply won't have anything to say. It won't state anything. So it won't correspond with any state of affairs, nor will it help matters to add human beings to this equation. For it's entirely possible, isn't it, that they might employ R to describe a vastly different state of affairs. Say planning as being a Harlequin romance novelist or something like that, rather than the one it does in fact describe. In either case, then, R will exist all right, but it will fail to correspond as one triple star prescribes. So it seems to me that premise one is indeed false, simply by virtue of what a premise would be if noma anti-realism were true. And this general line of criticism will extend to the other premises in the satisfaction argument as well. Okay, turning then to the validity of the argument. This brings us to a related problem. An inference from premises to conclusion is valid just in case it obeys the laws of logic. As C.I. Lewis reminds us, our proofs depend on these laws or principles. They are in fact presumed in our demonstrations. And that seems right. The satisfaction argument relies on two such laws, where P and Q are sentence tokens, L1 or law 1. If P implies Q in P, then Q. And it also depends on L2. P strictly implies Q if and only if it's impossible that P and not Q. And remember, Lewis says our proofs will depend on these laws or principles, and they're presumed in the demonstration. That's clearly the case in the satisfaction argument. That argument depends on L1 and L2. As we noted above, the first is modus ponens, and that's used to derive 4 from 1 through 3. The second, L2, validates the inference from 4 to 5. Now, intuitively, a valid deductive argument is one in which the premises strictly imply the conclusion. Translated into Noma talk, it's an argument in which the conclusion cannot but follow from the premises. Now, even if in the interest of charity, we restrict our attention to just those worlds in which the sentences comprising the satisfaction argument exist, it still seems to me perfectly possible, given Noma, that among these worlds, there be some in which its conclusion doesn't follow from its premises. Well, how so? Well, doesn't this seem to be right? It's perfectly possible that among these worlds, one or more of our logical laws, L1 or L2, qua sentence tokens, doesn't exist and is therefore unavailable to validate the requisite inferences. So these are worlds in which 1 through 5 exist qua sentence tokens, but L1 and L2 don't. Hence, there's no connection between premises and conclusions in these worlds. You might as well set your logic students a test in which they must instruct a series of natural deduction proofs in Copy-style logic, but without the aid of the inference and equivalence rules they've been using all semester. It's a hopeless business. But here the proponent of Noma is not without reply. Reaching back to those far off fabulous days when Molinism was all the rage in the journals. Many of you are aware that on Bill's Molinist scheme, and I share his sentiments with respect to Molinism, there are three logical moments in the structure of God's knowledge. The first of which is relevant for our purposes here. Bill describes it as follows. In the first moment is God's knowledge of all necessary truths. For example, the laws of logic. Statements which are true in this moment are true by virtue of the nature of God himself, and so do not depend on his will. He knows them to be true by his very nature, and so this first moment of divine knowledge is called natural knowledge. God could not lack this knowledge and still be God. The content of God's natural knowledge is essential to him. Here we learn that laws of logic are necessary truths, statements or sentences which cannot but correspond to God's nature. It's essential to God that he knows them to be true. It follows, if God is a necessary being, a logically necessary being, that he knows these true sentences in every possible world. No need to worry, therefore, about worlds in which L1 and L2 fail to exist, and consequently in which the conclusion of the satisfaction argument doesn't follow from its premises. This is a fascinating suggestion, but there's a price to be paid, and I'm going to leave it up to you to decide whether the price is right. On this account, it will be necessary, contrary to intuition, that there are concrete sentences. It will be necessary that there are sentences, concrete sentences. Further, some sentences, for example, the logical laws undergirding the satisfaction argument, will be such that they couldn't fail to correspond to reality. But if, as we've said, a sentence token can only be true if there are persons who use it to state or describe what is or could be or must be the case, it will then be necessary that there are persons. On a theistic view, of course, it will be implausible in excelsis to think or suppose that these are human persons. After all, it's hardly necessary that God creates the likes of us. But neither is it plausible to suppose that God, though a necessarily existing person, is obliged to somehow create and then use physical shapes or sounds to ensure an ample supply of sentences that he can then know to be true, lest he cease to exist. I mean, that would be bootstrapping. For my part, however, I cannot help but think that there are, in a heavyweight sense, necessary truths. Indeed, there are at least 7. The 5 that factor into the satisfaction argument itself, along with the 2 laws of logic that make it go. However, I also think that Bill is right, or nearly right, about abstract objects. They do flout God's aseity. Thus, we shouldn't think of the 7 as independent, uncreated, Platonic forms. But then neither, so we've seen, are they plausibly construed as concrete sentence tokens. The difficulties here attending these ontological extremes seem to me to largely fall off if the theist makes appeal to what he already knows, that God, a perfect epistemic agent, cannot but think of the 7 as true. Indeed, we might even say that the 7 just are God's thoughts, thoughts true by virtue of the nature of God himself, hence thoughts about what must be the case in any world. Of course, to avail ourselves of this option, we'd have to allow that there is a God and that he has thoughts. In some quarters, this will no doubt excite howls of protest. But is that something an evangelical philosopher need worry about? I doubt it. Indeed, it seems to be no more than the plain testimony of Scripture. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them, declares David. Well, that's the end of my paper. And so all that remains is for me to thank Bill for the twins, the twin volumes on God and Abstract Object and the twin volumes on the Atonement. I just want to register my deep appreciation for these 4 volumes and the joy and pleasure that I took in studying them in depth, as with all of Bill's works.
Well, I am going to read my paper. It's called Craig, Nominalism and the Penal Substitutionary Theory of the Atonement. And I would like to say up front, this is not written in the paper, but I agree, what Rich has said and what Bill has said. The issue about divine aseity here is utterly crucial, that if in some way Platonism cannot be modified, in order to accord or fit with Orthodox Christian theology, then so much the worse, for Platonism. So I share that concern. It's a very important concern. So let me just dive in and read what I've got, and then we'll be able to discuss later. Introduction. According to the Penal Substitutionary Theory of the Atonement, or PSA, Jesus Christ was our substitute when he bore the penalty for our sins in his death on the cross. For example, Isaiah 53, 5-6, or Romans 3, 23-27, as well as 5:8, 2 Corinthians 5:21, Hebrews 2:9, or 10:10, 1 Peter 3:18, as just samples. Thus, the PSA requires that in the incarnation, God, the second person of the Trinity, took on flesh and blood in the person of Jesus. Compare Hebrews 2:14. Now, the PSA involves several other important factors so that Christ could be our substitute. For example, as image bearers, people are to be like him, including morally. There are moral standards such as God's righteousness and justice that all humans should meet. Yet, according to Scripture, all humans, except for Christ, have sinned and fallen short of his glory, Romans 3:23. In order for God to forgive sinners, Jesus' propitiatory sacrifice must be efficacious for and applicable to many. These are but some examples of how there must be some equivalency so that Christ could be our penal substitute. However, which metaphysical theory we adopt to explain that equivalency might have major implications for the PSA. For instance, some have adopted realism, on which the factors I've mentioned above would be real, universal qualities. On that view, a universal is a one in many. It's one quality, yet it can be present in many instances. Thus, on realism, all humans, including Christ, share literally in a numerically identical human nature. And the moral qualities appropriate for us due to our nature are universals. However, another view about the nature of qualities is called nominalism, and according to it, there are no real universal qualities. Any quality would be particular, and any so-called universal would be what it is in name only. On its face, that result might seem to pose a problem for the PSA. For if nominalism is true, it would seem there would not be any qualities all humans, including Christ, literally have in common. If so, nominalism seems problematic for the PSA. For how could Jesus be fully human and therefore be our substitute in his atoning work? Now, recently, William Lane Craig, Bill, has defended both nominalism, or what he prefers, anti-Platonism, and the PSA. Excuse me. To be consistent, it seems that he must think that the PSA can be defended on a nominalist basis. But in this essay, I'm going to argue that nominalism cannot sustain the PSA. To help show this, first I'll explore in more detail two factors involved in Jesus' being our substitute. And second, I'll summarize Bill's nominalism and explore how it might explain the PSA. Third, I'm going to assess his nominalism and then apply those findings in relation to the PSA. Contrary to him, I'll suggest that the PSA needs a realist grounding in order to be viable. So, major heading, factors involved in Christ as our penal substitute. In order for Jesus to be our penal substitute, it seems that there must be several equivalency factors for which any metaphysical grounding of the PSA needs to account. And here I'm going to survey just a few. First, according to the Nicene Creed, Orthodox Christianity holds that God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, became fully human without giving up his deity. His being fully human suggests that there are essential and accidental properties of humans, for though he was fully human, he was without sin. Thus, sin, of course, is not essential, to being human. Second, the PSA presupposes that the atoning work of Christ can apply to humans in their stead, thereby paying the penalty each one owes for his or her sin. And crucially, this ability to be our substitute is deeply moral. Being without sin, Jesus met all the moral requirements God has, for humans. Obviously, the PSA presupposes that humans exist objectively, yet it also presupposes that there are objective moral standards that are grounded in God. Moreover, those standards apply to humans because they're made in God's image, and those who've been born of the Spirit, John 3:3-8, are to be conformed to his image. Humans are to be holy, for God is holy. They are to love because God is love and first loved them. Humans are to do what is just and upright because God is just and righteous. Moreover, for believers, since Christ is their life, the moral qualities he has as the perfect human are to be theirs too. Christians are to exemplify the fruit of the Spirit in their lives, which includes not just love, but additional moral qualities such as kindness, goodness, and mercy. These are God's qualities that his Spirit wants to produce in the lives of believers. These two equivalency factors will be my primary focus. Notice that both factors seem to presuppose that these qualities are shareable. That is, each one seems to be a universal. For instance, it seems that we are to share the very same moral qualities Jesus has as a human. Yet with these factors in place as some groundwork, let me explore Craig's alternatives of nominalism and how it might help explain the PSA. So here's another major heading, an overview of his appeals to nominalism in relation to the PSA. Craig has argued against Platonic universals, claiming that they are, quote unquote, uncreated abstract objects, end quote. And according to him, Platonic universals would exist necessarily and therefore independently of the Christian God, so that they would be self-existent and eternal. Accordingly, he believes Platonic universals fatally compromise God's aseity and the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, and therefore he rejects that view. Instead, to preserve God's uniqueness as the only self-existent being or entity, he has developed or defended various forms of nominalism. Failing that, he suggests one may fall back into divine conceptualism. So Craig embraces nominalism about things such as properties, propositions, numbers, and truth. And while he holds that these are not real, we still may speak of them by adopting Rudolf Carnap's philosophy of, quote, linguistic frameworks, which involves a way of speaking in a given framework, such as perhaps science, theology, ethics, properties, etc. Notably, unless one is speaking from an ontological framework, such talk doesn't commit that person to the existence of those things. Ontologically speaking, Craig seems to think that besides God, only concrete particulars that are located in space and time truly exist. Still, for him, the concrete objects can be immaterial or material. This stance seems to place him generally within the ontology of austere nominalism, on which these objects are primitively simple. That is, they're non-composite. As Robert Garcia explains, quote, austere nominalists hold that, strictly speaking, there are no properties, but only primitively charactered objects. There are spherical objects, billiard balls and the like, but no sphericity or sphericities per se, end quote. Michael Lux agrees, for austere nominalism endorses, quote, an ontology incorporating only concrete particulars, end quote. Consider Craig's treatment of morals in light of nominalism. He affirms that there are objective morals and duties. He argues that, quote, in moral experience, we do apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties, just as in sensory experience, we apprehend a realm of objectively existing physical objects, end quote. Yet to him, a moral virtue like justice does not exist as a Platonic abstract object. He explains, here, quote, it's difficult, however, to even comprehend this view. What's it mean to say, for example, that justice just exists? It's hard to know what to make of this. It's clear what is meant when it is said that a person's just, but it's bewildering when it is said that in the absence of any people, justice itself exists. Moral values seem to exist as properties of persons, not as mere abstractions. Or at any rate, it's hard to know what it is for a moral value to exist as a mere abstraction, end quote. Instead, Craig holds that justice is an attribute of God, which humans also can have, even though it's not a Platonic universal. Now, how might Craig's nominalism explain the PSA? There are various options available to austere nominalists, of course, such as predicate, concept, Mariological, class, and resemblance nominalism. Moreover, there are other nominalist attempts to explain the atonement, even going back to William of Ockham. But in Occam's case, his voluntarism led him to believe that God simply willed a covenant that he then followed. There was no necessity for Christ to die a substitutionary death in order to atone for our sin, nor was there any intrinsic merit in his work on the cross. I don't see Craig making that kind of move. Instead, he emphasizes the use of Carnap's linguistic frameworks. Accordingly, I think we should sketch how the PSA could be understood on that basis. On that basis, Craig could adopt perhaps a theological linguistic framework, or perhaps more specifically an evangelical theological linguistic framework. And from this framework, he could engage in discourse that would fit within standard evangelical theological discourse. Accordingly, it would be entirely appropriate to use sentences such as, quote, Jesus Christ took on a human nature, or Jesus was a propitiatory sacrifice for our sin, or Christ died for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God. In so doing, these claims, or theological claims, would fit with orthodoxy, yet they would not thereby commit him to making ontological claims. In this way, it seems this form of nominalism can retain its adherence to concrete particulars, as well as allow speakers to make orthodox theological claims. While it may seem that speakers are referring to real qualities that seem to be universals, they need not be doing any such thing. Instead, they simply could be following the conventions of that theological linguistic framework. So in this kind of view, there need not be real universal qualities that make these sentences true. Instead, humans, including Jesus, are concrete particulars, and there are equivalencies between him and us such that he could be our penal substitute. Moreover, nominalists could hold that these equivalency factors are brute facts. Thus, humans can be just and loving, and Jesus is just and loving, without making any commitment to universals. Instead, a particular human simply could be human-natured and just and loving, hyphens between each of those. With this background in mind, now let me consider a few implications of these views. And main heading here, assessing Craig's appeals to nominalism and the PSA. Let's return to the ontology of nominalism. For austere nominalism, as well as trope theory, the objects of nominalism are simple. They're not the union of two entities, for that would be what realists maintain about the exemplification of a property. Realists understand a property instance, for example, a human, who is just, as a complex entity that is the exemplification of the universal tied to a particular. On the other hand, nominalists hold that all particulars are really just one thing. For them, there cannot be a real distinction between an individuator and a quality or object. So let me apply that position to the concrete objects of austere nominalism, which are the kind of things it seems Craig believes are real, at least in creation. The distinction between the particularity and qualitative character of a concrete object must be an epistemological, not ontological one. That is, they are distinguished by how they are before our minds and how we pay attention to them and how we conceive of or speak about them. If that's the case, it seems we can eliminate either the individuator or particularizer or the qualitative character without real ontological loss. Suppose we eliminate the object's individuator. In that case, we're left with just qualitative character per se. But that seems to be like what realists claim. That qualitative character would seem to be metaphysically abstract. On the other hand, if we eliminate the qualitative content, that leaves us with an individuator that individuates nothing. It's bare, which seems to be incoherent. And thus either move seems to undermine austere nominalism. Now, nevertheless, consider a possible response by Craig or another austere nominalist. Suppose we can mentally isolate the particularity of a concrete object, such as a human, from its qualitativeness. For the nominalist, it's important to stress that this is just a mental or epistemic operation, a distinction of reason, if you will. For on the theory, in reality, there is just one simple thing. Going further, the nominalist can argue that by my claiming that we can think of the object's qualitativeness apart from its individuator, we therefore can ignore the object's qualitativeness without any loss in reality. And doing that is just to beg the question against austere nominalism in favor of realism. That is, by epistemically abstracting the individuator from the qualitativeness and then treating that distinction as an ontological one, I've assumed realism. Now, it's true that, according to austere nominalism, the distinction between an individuator and a quality is merely epistemological. There's no difference between them ontologically. Importantly, it's for that reason, I think, that we can eliminate either the individuator or quality in terms of what's real without any ontological loss. For the concrete object is, on this view, just one thing. I'm not claiming that since we can conceive of the object's qualitativeness apart from its individuator, we therefore can ignore the qualitativeness without loss in reality. Clearly, how we think about something doesn't change what something is, if that thing exists mind independently. Rather, the problem I am raising occurs precisely due to the ontology of austere nominalism. There's another widely accepted kind of rebuttal to this kind of argumentation, in which David Lewis argued that a nominalist could appeal to the existence of certain qualities as primitive or brute facts. In his new work for a theory of universals, Lewis claimed, quote, "Not every account is an analysis," end quote. Accordingly, when I argued that appeals to exact similarity actually cannot get started, Craig might reply that I've required an analysis beyond what's necessary. Now, following Lewis, Craig could reply that just is a brute fact that the objects of austere nominalism are simple, particular, concrete objects. For Lewis, quote, "An effort at systematic philosophy must indeed give an account of any purported fact," end quote, and accepting it as primitive is a justifiable way to do that. Indeed, quoting Lewis again, "A system that may take certain Morean facts as primitive, as unanalyzed, can't be accused of failing to make a place for them. It neither shirks the compulsory question nor answers it by denial. It does give an account," end quote. Now, certainly nominalists and others are entitled to appeal to what they consider to be brute facts. Generally, appeals to them are appropriate when it seems we cannot explain phenomena any further. Yet the point of my argument is that on austere nominalism, it seems there are no qualitative facts, much less any brute ones. There are just bare individuators. And if so, it seems Lewis's rebuttal misses the mark. It seems, therefore, that the concrete objects of austere nominalism cannot preserve the qualitativeness of any given thing in reality. Now, this result would extend to the penal substitutionary work of Christ on our behalf. There wouldn't be any equivalency between Christ and humans, and so he could not be our substitute. There would not even be such a thing as human nature, and no human, including Christ, would have it. Nor would there be equivalency between God's moral qualities, including the fruit of the Spirit, and ours. Indeed, humans could not enjoy several fruits of the application of the PSA to their lives. For instance, it doesn't seem humans could live in a deep unity of heart and mind with God, for they wouldn't even have those qualities. Moreover, they would not be able to have an experience of the love of God being poured out into their hearts through his Spirit, or his Spirit's crying out in them, Abba, Father. Such experiences would have qualities, it seems, and yet austere nominalism seems to undermine them too. Instead, it seems at best humans would be just zombies without any experiences. Furthermore, even if austere nominalism's objects could have qualities, it's hard to understand how we would be able to enjoy the benefits of Christ's atonement by being forgiven and inheriting eternal life. For at any given time, a particular human would be identical with a primitively charactered object. For instance, a human at time t1 could be and this is hyphenated, human-natured and loving and highly educated person. Suppose at t2, that person trusted Christ as Savior and Lord. And in that case, it seems that the person at t2 would be characterized differently, such as, and again hyphenated, human-natured and loving and highly educated and forgiven person. So it seems that the person at T1 would not be identical with the person at T2. But if so, then the promise of forgiveness and eternal life cannot apply to the very people who trust Christ. For the person at T1 was not forgiven of his or her sins. Rather, a different person who came into being at T2 would have eternal life. Worse, it seemed that Jesus could not have atoned for our sins, for he who was raised from the dead would not consist of the same characterization as he who died in our place. They would not be identical. But if so, it seems that sin and its penalty, death, actually would have won over Jesus who died in our place. Conclusion. Indeed, taken consistently, it seems that on austere nominalism, there wouldn't even be any humans. They wouldn't have any qualities, but instead would be just bare particulars. Yet such a result seems deeply incoherent and utterly contrary to our experience. Moreover, it would undermine any scientific investigation into humans, much less the rest of creation. As I've argued, this result seems to undermine the PSA, for there is no one to whom Christ's atoning work can be applied. Moreover, God, the second person of the Trinity, could not have become incarnate, for there wouldn't have been any human qualities to assume. If those results seem deeply contrary to Scripture, for these kind of reasons, it seems to me that the PSA presses us away from at least an austere nominalist ontology of qualities. Instead, it seems that the PSA presupposes, and perhaps even needs, a realist kind of grounding. While I've not tried to survey all the varieties of nominalism for the PSA, including tropes, I've tried to focus on what I think would be Craig's most likely kind of approach or approaches. While I deeply appreciate his work to defend the PSA, I don't think it can be sustained in the light of his appeals to nominalism. Thank you. Now we'll hear from Dr. Craig in response.
All right. Like Rich, I have pre-recorded my talk so that it can include visuals that will make it more understandable to you. So at this time, we'll run the pre-recorded talk. I'm grateful to my colleagues for considering my work on divine aseity to be worthy of this panel discussion. In my work, I explicitly and clearly repudiate the label nominalism because of the inevitable confusions that its use would engender. The word nominalism is used to denote quite different positions in two distinct philosophical debates. The first is the age-old debate over universals, about which Scott Smith is concerned, nominalism being the position that there are no universals. The second concerns a very recent debate centered in the philosophy of mathematics, which has arisen only since Gottlob Frege's Foundations of Arithmetic, 1884. In this debate, nominalism is the position that abstract objects like numbers do not exist. A nominalist in the context of the first debate is not necessarily a nominalist in the context of the second, and vice versa. So, my preferred label is anti-Platonism, which denies that uncreated abstract objects exist. Anti-Platonism comes in two versions, realist and anti-realist versions. Rich Davis, for example, is a realist anti-Platonist, whereas I tend to favor anti-realist versions of anti-Platonism. I'm not sure what Scott Smith's position is. I reject Platonism on theological grounds as incompatible with the doctrine of divine aseity, the doctrine that God is the sole uncreated reality. I am therefore open to any sort of anti-Platonism, whether realist or anti-realist, and conduct an open-ended exploration of available alternatives. Now, I think it's clear that my more recent work on the doctrine of the atonement has no intrinsic connection with my anti-Platonism. In my work on the atonement, I freely adopt talk of propositions and properties without thinking to be making ontological commitments. So, my statements about the atonement serve at best an illustrative purpose to point to certain properties or propositions which the Platonist wants to include in his ontology. Any properties or propositions would have served the same illustrative purpose. Therefore, I shall have nothing more to say about the atonement this morning, but shall address myself to the question of the existence of properties and propositions. Rich is concerned with the reality of propositions. Since I reject the Neo-Quinian criterion of ontological commitment, which says that we are committed in a metaphysically heavyweight sense to the reality of the values of the variables bound by the existential quantifier in sentences we take to be true, since, as I say, I reject that criterion, I'm quite happy to affirm in the ordinary language, metaphysically lightweight sense that there are propositions. If one does insist on talking in a metaphysically heavyweight sense, then I should say, as Rich notes, the talk of propositions is either figurative or make-believe or just plain false. I think Rich is mistaken in thinking that indispensability arguments involving concrete sentences are ontologically committing. They're not, because the Neo-Quinian criterion is just false. In the case of concrete sentences, there's just no theological objection to their existence. So, as Rich notes, I have no objection to the truth of concrete sentences or thoughts. But that doesn't imply that I think we can substitute talk of sentence tokens for talk of propositions. During the Jurassic period, after all, there were no sentence tokens. As I wrote in my paper on truth, to which Rich responds, and I quote, Tarski's T-schema, stating a material condition on any theory of truth, S is true if and only if S, though stated for a language L, cannot reasonably be thought to take sentence tokens of L as substituents for S, because the right to left implication of the Tarski biconditionals seems clearly false. It is not the case, for example, that if the Tyrannosaurus at time t and place L is eating a trachodon, then it is true that the Tyrannosaurus at TL is eating a trachodon, where what is true is a sentence token. What I want to avoid is the idea that during the Jurassic period, there were, in a metaphysically heavyweight sense, true propositions. So I've defended a deflationary view of truth, according to which truth is not a substantial metaphysical property. Rather, the truth predicate is simply a device of semantic assent, a way of talking about an assertion rather than making the assertion. Rather than say, during the Jurassic period, it was true that dinosaurs existed, we can descend semantically and say, during the Jurassic period, dinosaurs existed. We truly assert something if and only if reality is as we have asserted it to be. Rich fails to see that so descending semantically, we have thereby ceased to talk about truth. We have adopted an adverbial strategy which avoids reference to any property of truth. So when we come to Rich's two objections from premises and validity, he rightly objects to trying to get along without propositional talk by talking about sentence tokens instead. I agree with him. So I should say that Rich goes wrong right from the start when he interprets my statement, necessarily retributive justice is essential to God, to be paraphrased as necessarily the sentence token, retributive justice is essential to God, is true. He has ascended semantically to ascribe truth to a sentence token. But as he notes, that sentence token is not necessarily true, for there are possible worlds where those English words have a completely different meaning, so that the sentence does not correspond to reality. So, if one wants to talk about truth, we need to make believe that there are propositions that can be necessarily true. Fortunately, we do not need to make such a semantic assent, nor need we take our make-believe objects seriously. What about validity? Rich points out that it's perfectly possible that one or more of our logical laws, that is, qua sentence tokens, doesn't exist and is therefore unavailable to validate the requisite inferences. Rich rightly says we can't plausibly ascribe to God the use of concrete sentences in order to have necessary logical truths. But again, my strategy rejects trying to substitute talk of sentence tokens for talk of propositions. Now, Rich affirms, I cannot help but think there are, in a heavyweight sense, necessary truths. As a deflationist, I disagree. But Rich goes on to say, and I quote, however, I also think Bill is right, or nearly right, about abstract objects. They flout God's aseity. Thus, we shouldn't think of them as independent, uncreated Platonic forms. But neither are they plausibly construed as sentence tokens. The difficulties attending these ontological extremes largely fall off if the theist makes appeal to what he already knows, that God, a perfect epistemic agent, cannot but think of them as true. Indeed, we might even say that they just are God's thoughts, thoughts true by virtue of the nature of God himself. Hence, thoughts about what must be the case in any world. I hope it's clear that I am quite content theologically with such an anti-Platonistic realism, though I do worry about the proliferation of divine thoughts that such a conceptualism requires. I'm not convinced that we need to go so far in the direction of realism, but I have no theological objection to such a divine conceptualism. Now, Scott, interested as he is in the medieval debate over universals, focuses on the reality of properties. He draws attention to my appeal to Carnap's use of the divisive linguistic frameworks in order to justify talk of abstract objects without ontological commitment to them. If one adopts a linguistic framework in which it makes sense to talk of numbers, for example, then one may assert that there are odd numbers, and no one would think to disagree. But this is but a façon de parler. Outside that linguistic framework, as I suggested in response to Rich, talk of numbers is either figurative or make-believe or just plain false. Now the same applies to properties. Unfortunately, Scott misunderstands the use of such linguistic frameworks. He says, on that basis, Craig could adopt a theological linguistic framework, or perhaps more specifically, an evangelical theological linguistic framework. Within this framework, we could supposedly speak about properties which we in Christ share. But the framework to be adopted here is not a theological linguistic framework, much less an evangelical theological linguistic framework. That would avail nothing for ontologically non-committing talk of properties. Rather, what we adopt is a property framework within which we can speak of shared properties without ontological commitment. With respect to the ontology of anti-realism, Scott correctly notes that objects, even if physically composed, are not metaphysically composed. For example, they do not have a bare particular and properties as ontological constituents. So, Scott says, the distinction between the particularity and the qualitative character of a concrete object must be merely epistemic, not ontological. If that is the case, Scott infers, it seems that we can eliminate either the particularizer or the qualitative character without real ontological loss. Suppose we eliminate the object's individuator. In that case, we are left with just qualitative character per se. But that seems to be what realists claim. On the other hand, if we eliminate the qualitative content, that leaves us with a bare individuator, which is incoherent, and thus realism wins the day. I think that Scott's argument is patently question-begging. Only if you presuppose a real composition of individuator and universal would the elimination of one leave the other one left over. On anti-realism, neither of them exists in the first place, much less after such a mental abstraction. Now, to Scott's credit, he anticipates this response. He says, Craig will respond that by epistemically abstracting the individuator from the qualitativeness and then treating that distinction as an ontological one, I have assumed realism. Right. But Scott denies that he is begging the question in favor of realism. He says, rather, the problem I am raising occurs precisely due to the ontology of austere nominalism. The point of my argument is that on austere nominalism, there are no qualitative facts, much less any brute ones. There are just bare particulars. No, Scott, on anti-realism, there are neither qualities nor bare particulars. In saying that the elimination of qualities leaves us with just bare particulars left over, you are presupposing realism. When Scott gravely intones that on austere nominalism there would not be any humans, such alarmist rhetoric is, I think, the reductio ad absurdum of his objection. One last point. Near the end of his paper, Scott raises the so-called problem of temporary intrinsics. How can the identical object have different properties at two different times? Doesn't the indiscernibility of identicals require the object to be perfectly similar at both times? This is a question to which the debate over realism and anti-realism about properties is irrelevant. It is just as much a problem for the realist as for the anti-realist. Rather, as I have argued elsewhere, the solution to the problem of temporary intrinsics lies in affirming a theory of tensed time, sometimes called the A theory of time, according to which all the properties an object has, it has at present, so that it can change in its intrinsic properties over time. These are difficult questions, and I thank my respondents for the stimulus of interacting with their papers.
All right. Thank you, Bill and Rich. We've got a couple questions already in the Q&A board, but maybe we can take a few minutes and just chat amongst each other here. And I'll leave it open for you guys to initiate that if you want. I've got a few in mind, but we do that.
Okay, Bill, maybe I could start. I was surprised at how close our views actually are. There's very little differences between them. But one thing I was wondering was, you pointed out that with respect to proposition 1 that I had listed there, where I attach is true to that sentence token, and you said that's a semantic assent. What do you think of this idea? I was thinking of this morning, just as in spiritual matters, there's a kind of assent where we're challenged to be Christ-like and aspire to that. So in a sense, we're spiritually ascending to that level. But then there's some kinds of spiritual assent that are inappropriate. So in Isaiah 14, where Lucifer says, I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and so on. So maybe there's some kinds of truth predicates. Like if a truth predicate says of itself, I shall ascend to the Platonic heaven and become an abstract property, then it has to be cast down and it must descend. But if it just says, I'm only going to rise to the level of corresponds with reality. So when I move into one star, one double star, and one triple star, I'm trying to represent you as saying, you can say of a sentence token that it corresponds with reality, or that it directly asserts something about reality. And in that sense, you're talking about the sentence token. So in that sense, you've ascended a bit. But
Oh, yes.
could you say, but it's not an unacceptable assent?
Well, I think what made it unacceptable in this case was the modal operator necessarily. And there, I agreed entirely with you, Rich, that you can't say that those sentence tokens are necessarily true. Now, in my original paper on truth that you alluded to, I do give justification for ascending semantically on occasion to ascribe truth. And this is in the case of so-called blind truth ascriptions, where we either do not know what was asserted so as to assert it ourselves, or there were too many assertions for us to repeat them all. So, for example, we could make a blind truth ascription in the case of saying everything in the secret documents is true. And we don't know what's in the secret documents, but we're confident that everything in the secret documents are true. Or we could say everything that the Catholic Church has ever promulgated is true. And there are just too many to repeat. So that these blind truth ascriptions are useful, but I don't think that they ultimately mean that truth is therefore going to be a significant metaphysical property that we can't get along with. It's just our finitude that requires us to make such blind truth ascriptions. For God, there would be no need to do that at all.
Okay, so would it be safe to say that in that same paper, you say getting rid of propositional truth has the advantage of ridding us of abstract truth bearers? So is the semantic descent for the purposes of getting rid of something, getting rid of the abstract reference? Because in a sense, you can ascend and say, this sentence token describes reality or it corresponds. But you wouldn't want to descend and get rid of that, would you? Because then you have no alephic features of your premise at all.
Not necessarily. As I said, I'm quite happy to talk about thoughts or sentence tokens as truth bearers because they're concrete. But you're quite right. My motivation is to get rid of these uncreated abstract objects out of my desire to safeguard divine aseity.
Okay. Maybe just one last point, because I'm a Molinist myself. And so when I thought about your view, I thought, well, what am I going to do with that first moment in God's knowledge, his natural knowledge? So we've got these logical laws, but I don't know what you were in 1987. I don't think were you thinking about?
No. I wasn't. In any case, remember, I am not disputing, Rich, that abstract object talk is indispensable. That's not the attack. It's not to say we can dispense with it. Probably abstract object talk is indispensable for doing science, for example, and mathematics and so forth. My main point is that you can't infer from indispensability to metaphysically heavyweight ontological commitments.
So God has knowledge in that first moment. It's a natural knowledge. But what are these logical laws? I mean, they can't be sentences because that's the third moment of God's knowledge where he creates the world. It's not abstract objects because they don't exist. So it seemed to me as though the Molinist could say, look, you could be a nominalist with respect to all these abstracta, but in that first moment of God's knowledge, there's only really thoughts, isn't there? To take the place of these logical laws. And you wouldn't have to proliferate because all you're committing yourself to as a nominalist would be God has thoughts, and they're going to stand in for these logical laws.
Right. I have no theological objection to that. And I think that propositions would be the most plausible candidate for identifying with God's thoughts. But that doesn't get rid of the whole Platonic horde. I mean, numbers, for example, are less plausibly identified as thoughts of God, or properties and possible worlds and things like that. So while the equation of propositions with God's thoughts seems natural and intuitive, there are a lot of other Platonic objects that are less plausibly identified with thoughts. And so my question would be here as well, can we even get rid of the thoughts? And here, I think William Alston's article, Does God Have Beliefs?, is very helpful, where Alston denies that God has beliefs. Beliefs or propositions are simply the way in which we fragment and break up God's seamless apprehension of reality into propositional bits that we can handle. And this is in the classic tradition of the medievals, who thought of God's cognition as simple, and therefore they didn't take the plurality of divine ideas with ontological seriousness. So that would be the route I would prefer to go, though I have no objection to conceptualism theologically.
Okay.
Mhm. This is maybe somewhat of a related question, but I wonder, Bill, if you could help me understand too. As I was reading or listening to your comments about Rich's paper, it got me wondering, in light of your discussion about sentences, versus propositions, what would you say, and this is from an ontological linguistic framework, I'm asking this, what is a meaning?
Oh, I'm not sure, Scott. That is not a subject that I tackled in my work. I would just say that if they are uncreated abstract objects, then my anti-realism would be committed to saying they don't exist,
Sure.
and that therefore we're not committed to them. But we need to be very careful here, Scott. Just as denying the existence of properties does not mean that the anti-realist cannot say God is just and good and people are just and good. So in the same way, it doesn't commit him to saying this sentence is meaningful, or that I meaningfully asserted that I believe in God, or something like that. You don't need to have an ontology that includes these objects in it in order to talk about things being in certain ways, or certain sentences being meaningful.
Yeah.
Because you're getting rid of the nominal reference, the singular term, and you're substituting an adjective. The sentence is meaningful. Even on Quine's criterion, that doesn't commit you to meanings, because meaningful is an adjective. It's only the values of the variables that are bound by the existential quantifier that you're ontologically committed to.
How does this, maybe you can tie something else for me together here. Your theory of reference.
Yes.
With this talk, with subject of meanings, I guess. I'm trying to remember here, and I'm going to botch it, I'm afraid. But from your, again, the same discussion with Rich's paper, it sounds like it's people refer, to things. Using, we speak, we use sentences, doing that. So I'm trying to think, the meaning then is something that we could say is what? I'm adopting a property framework here, but the meaning is a property of the person's mind, or is it a property of the sentence?
I guess I would say it's a property of the sentence, that the sentence has a linguistic meaning. Now, I do think that there is also such a thing as speaker's meaning that is different from linguistic meaning in some cases. For example, if I see a couple walking in the park and I say to you, her husband is kind to her.
Uh-huh.
The linguistic meaning is that they're a married couple and he's kind to her. But suppose, in fact, he's not her husband, that he's some stranger or something that's walking with her. In that case, the speaker's meaning that I'm referring to that couple, her husband is kind to her. That's the speaker's meaning, even though the linguistic meaning refers to her husband, who may be in another city, or maybe she's a widow or something, doesn't have a husband. So linguistic meaning and speaker's meaning, I think, can fall apart on occasion.
Okay.
Got some questions in the chat there.
We do. Let me go back to one from addressed to Bill originally, and then the follow-up is this person would like Rich and myself to chime in whether or not we think Bill's answer works. And my thing just got scrolled down on me, sorry. Here's the question. Bill, on your view, what is it that makes it the case that you, Scott, and Rich are all humans? And further, how do you account for things like quote unquote human rights and the biblical language concerning quote unquote human nature?
In my work on the historical atom that I have just completed, I discuss what it is to be human. And I would say that to be human is to have a body which is anatomically like ours, and this organism exhibits properties like symbolic behavior, innovativeness in technology, the structured use of domestic space, and other sorts of cognitive capacities that are unique to us. So that's the way I would define what's being a human. You don't need to refer to properties at all. You can just assert that an organism that is anatomically like us and has a hominid body and has symbolic cognition and is a language user is human. And then human nature, that's just a sort of, that's property talk. Within the property framework, you can talk about natures, but outside of that framework, you would say that this is either just a figurative way of speaking, it's a useful metaphor, or that it's just make-believe, or that it's just false.
Well, my quick thought is that most, if not all of those things sound like they can be simply behavioral matters. And if so, that seems to be, I'll be careful what I, think this out a little bit before I just stick my foot in my mouth. but they do seem like they're behavioral. And it,
yes.
And that does actually relate back to, part of the thinking in the back of my mind as far as asking you the question about meanings, because one thing I wondered when hearing your response to Rich was just, is meaning a matter of use according to a particular framework? And that would fit with this sort of thing as far as what is human nature. It's getting rid of metaphysical, kinds of consideration, and instead focusing on.
I guess behavior. What I was really looking for would be, how do we identify a human being, rather than define him? That these would be sufficient conditions of humanness when we encounter them. And you're right, some are behavioral. But I mean, if you wanted to give a more ontological definition, you could say something like a human being is a union of a hominid body with a soul that is a person.
Okay, just in the spirit of the question that was asked, whether or not I think, the answer would work, I think that might not be sufficient. Given, well, hominid body, perhaps, I'll take it back, but I'm just thinking of Peter Singer's understanding of humans. You could have a person, there who is actually, not, a Homo sapien. So I'm not sure that definition is sufficient.
Okay, now let's be very careful here, Scott, because this is a question I deal with extensively in this book on Adam. I don't identify humanity with Homo sapiens.
Okay.
I think Neanderthals are human. And I think Denisovans are human. I think Homo heidelbergensis was human. But I do not think that Australopithecines were human. So we shouldn't restrict humanity or humanness just to the modern species Homo sapiens. I think there are a plurality of human species that have existed on this planet. And this is not talking about ape men or, you know, primitive hybrids. The burden of my work is to show that Neanderthals, for example, exemplified that sort of capacity for symbolic thought, language, and abstract thinking that is unique to human beings, and that therefore it would be prejudicial to write them out of the human race.
Rich, anything you want to add?
No, I think that it springs to mind that you're thinking that man is a rational animal. Sounds,
Yeah.
in a sense, it's the Greek conception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's another question. Bill, again, it's addressed to you. If I understood you correctly, you stated that you are in favor of both realist and anti-realist versions of anti-Platonism. Can you imagine and briefly explain an anti-Platonist theory with which you would not agree?
I think it could rightly be said of me that William Lane Craig never met an anti-Platonist theory that he didn't like. Here might be one. Here might be one. There's a view called quantifier variance, which says that the existential quantifier has two meanings: a metaphysically heavyweight meaning and a metaphysically lightweight meaning. And that therefore this quantifier variance would enable you to deny ontological commitments when you are using the existential quantifier with the lightweight meaning. And I'm inclined not to think that that's true. I'm inclined to agree with neutralists who say that the existential quantifier is just neutral in its ontological commitments. Not that there are two quantifiers, but it's just neutral. So that would be one response to the indispensability argument that I'm not sympathetic to, and therefore I chose to overlook in the book. I didn't even discuss it at any length.
Okay. All right, we have another question here, and this is addressed to Bill and myself. It says, nominalism requires fewer entities than realism. But it seems the best explanation of laws in nature requires universals. For example, laws hold because of a necessary relation between, I'm sorry, my screen's jumping here. For example, laws hold because of a necessary relation between universals. Can anomalists give an equally good account? Would you like me to repeat it? Or?
No, would you like me to respond?
Please.
I think that it is controversial to talk about whether or not the laws of nature require a relationship between universals. I know that's the way some theorists think of them, but by no means is that a sort of consensus view. I've not tried to give an account of the laws of nature insofar as they are mathematical in nature, mathematical equations like the laws of quantum mechanics or the laws of relativity theory. I would just say that the use of such equations doesn't commit you to the reality of the singular terms that appear in those equations. So they're not really any different than 2 + 2 = 4, which I think does not commit you ontologically to an object, 2 + 2, and another object, 4, and that these are the identical object. It would seem to me that these mathematical laws of nature are just more complex mathematical equations.
Okay. I, since the question is directed to me too, I guess I'd like to raise a little different line of thought. I'm not so sure that there are actually fewer entities on nominalist kind of account than a realist. At least, it seems that fundamental ones, because it seems that, for the realist, there are things like a universal and then, an exemplification relation and then instances. But for the nominalist, it seems like, and I'm using that as an umbrella term here, covering the many specific views within that, but it seems that there are a myriad of brute facts, to which we end up appealing. So as far as preferring one that doesn't multiply entities and questions it unnecessarily or not, it seems like realism is a simpler theory in that regard. I don't know. You guys want to say anything to that, or?
Well, and I think one question that arises here, Scott, and I don't know your view, but do you think that uninstantiated properties exist?
I do.
Okay, because that will give you an actual infinite number of properties, because even though there are only a finite number of instances, you're going to have non-denumerable uninstantiated properties.
Okay, yeah, good point. Just to speak a little more, because I know you did in your response essay too. I think for me, back in the old Phil Foundations book that you and JP did,
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the second edition, on it. I remember, you guys have a back and forth in there.
Yeah.
And JP, raises the idea of a modified Platonism.
Yes.
And I think if Platonism is unmodified, I'm saying this to kind of say, where am I at? If you have Platonism that's unmodified, then it seems like you've got these uncreated, abstract entities, and that is a threat, to divine aseity. So you're every bit right, to go after that. I sure agree with you on that.
Okay.
I do think, though, JP's suggestion there makes a lot of sense, to me, that we could hold a modified kind of one. God has created these, but in the sense of sustains these in existence timelessly.
Right.
And of course, I think your response there was that might be question begging, or it seems like it, is. I think that was the answer.
Well, that view is typically called absolute creation, after Tom Morris and Christopher Menzel's article back in 1982, which was in fact what sparked my interest in this very topic, was this very paper on absolute creation. And
Yeah.
the big problem that has faced that view is the so-called bootstrapping objection. Namely, in order to create properties like being powerful,
yeah.
God already has to be powerful. Now, I do think there's a way out for the modified Platonist or the absolute creationist, but I'm not aware of anybody that's taken it. So that's in the book.
Okay. Very good. Right now we don't have any more open questions. I'm surprised.
I've got a question.
Please.
Bill, you mentioned the criterion of ontological commitment.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you distinguish that from attempts by folks like C.S. Lewis to say, we can listen to people talking on the bus. And when they're quarreling and they say, I gave you a piece of my orange, hey, you should be giving me a piece of your orange. And he said, he seems to be saying we can infer from that they're actually committed to the reality of the law of right and wrong, objective moral values, by the way they talk.
Yeah.
And sometimes apologetics connected to the moral argument will attempt to use people's behavior or their speaking for that purpose. Would you resist that kind of an inference? From the way people talk, we can infer that at some level they do believe in objective moral values.
I would resist that with respect to abstract objects. Our talk, our ordinary language is permeated with singular terms that seem to have no real world reference to them. For example, we refer to the touchdown that was scored at the end of the fourth quarter, but that doesn't commit you to there being some objects, touchdowns and fourth quarters. These are socially constructed realities within the game of football. And our language is just permeated with that kind of talk. So I don't think that the average person takes his ordinary language talk with ontological or metaphysically heavy seriousness. Now, with regard to C.S. Lewis, for those who maybe are listening and are Lewis fans, I want to refer them to Lewis's essay, Blue Spells and Flallan Spheres, which many say is the finest essay that Lewis ever wrote. And in it, he applies linguistic metaphors to mathematical language. And he takes a figuralist view of mathematics and says we're not committed ontologically to these mathematical objects because we can understand mathematical talk metaphorically. It's a really quite unusual essay.
I didn't know about that. Another example that springs to mind would be, I don't know how you read Romans chapter 1, but it seems to me that God is saying to these people who are suppressing the knowledge of God that you're committed to my existence. You're committed to believing that I exist by virtue of the fact that you can see the things that have been made. And then, at least in my 1984 NIV, that's the year I got saved, so I only use the 1984. It says that the invisible attributes, God's eternal power and divine nature, have been understood from the things that have been made. So it seemed to me that there's a kind of inference happening there.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you think that someone's thinking in certain ways, their inferential thinking, can commit them to a conclusion that they themselves explicitly deny.
Oh, I'm sure that's true, Rich. I mean, isn't it true that very often truths we affirm have unseen implications that we didn't realize? And when those are exposed, very often people will try to back away from them and say, oh, well, I didn't mean that. So I think that's certainly true.
So could that not be true if so we're uttering a bunch of sentences right now. So in so doing, doesn't that mean we're committed to whatever we call the things that we're uttering?
If you believe in the Neo-Quinian criterion of ontological commitment, then you are saddled with all sorts of ontological commitments that you never dreamt of. Right. But what I want to say is that the criterion is just wrong, and that therefore you are not so saddled.
So could the criterion be limited? So, I mean, general principles still can have true substitution instances. So as long as we weren't appealing to abstracta, we could say, you're uttering a sentence or you're inscribing it. For example, your satisfaction argument, when you wrote that down, don't you think that the minute you wrote that down, you were committed to there being premises and a conclusion?
No, not at all, because as I said, this is done within a linguistic framework in which it's acceptable to adopt that façon de parler. But it's not meant to be taken with ontological seriousness. I'm not doing metaphysics there, I'm doing theology. So, no. And it's not just abstract objects either, Rich, that this Neo-Quinian criterion would commit us to. Yeah. I mentioned before socially constructed objects, things like mortgages, principalities,
touchdowns,
divorce,
Hmm.
differences of opinion, shades of gray, early morning hours, it will lead to an ontologically inflationary view of the world if we adopt this criterion. So it's not just abstract objects. It will saddle us with all sorts of commitments, unless, now, and to be fair to the Quinean, unless you can paraphrase them away. The Neo-Quinean will allow you to paraphrase so as to eliminate those commitments. So, for example, rather than say the number of moons of Mars is 2, which would commit me ontologically to the number 2, I can paraphrase and say Mars has 2 moons.
Okay.
And that adjectival use of the number is not ontologically committing. So the Quinean will allow for paraphrase to avoid these ontological commitments of ordinary language. But I mean, what an overhaul of ordinary language would be contemplated here. This would involve an artificial language which nobody speaks and nobody has any idea of how to construct.
Okay. Maybe what I'm thinking of is more the act of inscription, or the act of utterance that commits us to certain things, as opposed to just the use of language. I just can't see how you can record those premises on page 94 of your book and then say, I'm not committed to the existence of premises, even though I just put some premises on my page.
Well, I mean, nowhere does, of course, you want to get away from language. I mean, I was going to say, nowhere did I say these premises exist. I asserted them.
Oh.
And I don't think that assertions are ontologically committing. But that would be a quite different criteria. I mean, go ahead and develop it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, whether there's the Quinean criteria and then there's something else I have in mind.
Yeah.
Because
I don't know.
You do say statements directly asserted are descriptive of the world as it actually is. So I took you to be directly asserting 1 through 5 on that page.
Right. Yeah, I assert them, but I don't say that they exist, or even, I don't think I even say they're true. I just assert them. And I think I truly assert them.
Right.
That's adverbial. There's no problem there.
Like, can you assert something without asserting it as descriptive? Because I don't know what asserting it is. It sounds like you're giving it a positive affirmation.
You want to be descriptive. That's right. You want it to correspond to the world. But that doesn't mean that every singular term in the sentence has some real world object corresponding to it. Like the examples that I just gave a moment ago about mortgages and things.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Guys, we're getting a few more questions in the thing here. Here's one that came in first here. Dr. Craig, could you say more about your worry with the proliferation of divine thoughts that seems to come with conceptualism? What is that worry, and do you take it to be fatal to conceptualism?
Well, let me answer these in reverse order. No, I don't take it to be fatal. What I share are some worries, as I put it, about conceptualism that I hope will motivate the Christian philosopher or theologian to consider more seriously anti-realist proposals. On conceptualism, it's not enough for God to have merely dispositional beliefs about things. He has to have occurrent beliefs, actual thoughts in consciousness corresponding to every proposition. So there will be infinities of infinities of infinities of these thoughts. And these would include things, as Graham Oppy says, like banal thoughts, trivial thoughts, vulgar and vile thoughts. He has to be thinking, for example, that the Taj Mahal is not identical to any real number that you might name. And I would ask myself, and Oppie asked, why in the world think that God is thinking about those things? Why, I mean, of course he knows them, but why would he have occurrent in consciousness such trivial and banal and vulgar thoughts as would be necessary to correspond to every proposition? And so that's just a worry, I think, to say maybe we need to have a more plausible view of divine consciousness.
I'd like to throw one in here if I may. This is my own, not a question, but a response. Actually, I had typed up for another purpose, a response to the objection you gave, to me when I was trying to say we either end up with a particular or the quality and can eliminate either one. And I let me try this response and see what you think. Nevertheless, Craig has objected that this move is patently question-begging for, quote, only if you presuppose a real composition of individuator and universal, would the elimination of one leave the other one left over. On anti-realism, neither of them exists in the first place, much less after such a mental abstraction, end quote. Instead, on Craig's anti-realism, there are no metaphysically real properties or individuators. Thus, quote, in saying that the elimination of qualities leaves us with just bare particulars left over, end quote, I've presupposed realism. So in response, it's vital that we keep clear that an object on austere nominalism is simple. I think on any form, nominalism. Yet what that does not mean is it cannot play various roles. We can regard, for instance, and these are hyphenated, justified, forgiven human as playing various roles, including its qualitativeness and its individuation. Moreover, it seems clear that he takes such a human, along with other examples of concrete particulars, to be real. I mean, we're really here, for example. For instance, some non-human examples could include these are hyphenated, brown, short-haired dachshund, or a small red delicious apple. Surely Craig is not trying to say that the dog is not brown or the apple's not red.
Right.
So it seems that for him, there is real qualitativeness and particularity to concrete objects, but since the objects are simple, these quote unquote features should not be understood to be ontological constituents, thereof. So on the view, this means that an object's qualitativeness and particularity are identical. There is no distinction in reality. If so, then that qualitativeness just is that particularity, and the object ends up being just a particular. Yet we should ask a particular what? And to be a particular, or to be a particular seems to require that something is being particularized. Any thoughts or?
Well, just that the move to say that if they're not ontologically composed, then the qualitativeness just is the particular. I just don't think that's right. I think that instead, one just rejects that whole compositional viewpoint of ontology, that the thing is not composed of a particular and properties. And so it's not identifying the two, it's just not ontologically composed. And I like the way you put it. There are brown dachshunds and red apples, but we don't need to have or reify the redness and the brownness to make those additional objects to the dog and the fruit.
Yeah, okay. Let me go back to the question board here. It's getting a little longer here. Here's one. This is directed to Bill. A friend of mine thinks that there are stronger arguments for abstracta than indispensability arguments. Sorry.
Ah,
He presents the following. Numbers are such that if they possibly exist, they necessarily exist. Numbers possibly exist, so they necessarily exist. The way out would be to deny that numbers possibly exist. But what would an argument for impossibility of numbers look like? Is their very concept incoherent?
well, I do think it's impossible that numbers exist as Platonic objects, and my reason is theological. As I said, I'm not raising philosophical objections to Platonism, but theological objections. God exists in every possible world, and therefore there are no possible worlds in which there exist, in addition to God, uncreated objects. And so, if that's what we mean by numbers, uh, it's not even possible that numbers exist.
Bill, what would you say to the idea that numbers are quantifiers? I first came upon this
Yeah.
idea in Reinhard Grossman's book called The Existence of the World. And he said, well, they're quantities, right? So there's the universal and the particular quantifiers, but why couldn't four things are such that dot,
Right.
dot, dot?
Yes, that is one way in which one can avoid ontological commitment to numbers by having these quantifiers, like there are three things and there are five things, therefore there are eight things. But the problem is that that won't work with a lot of other mathematical discourse where we say things like, there are odd numbers, or the number of natural numbers is actually infinite, or there is an infinite set, or the empty set is a member of every set. You just can't do it with those. So while it's true that certain quantitative truths could be eliminated, or not eliminated, but could be paraphrased in such a way as to avoid ontological commitment, there's just too much of mathematics that isn't paraphrasable in that way.
Okay. Do you know what it would mean to say that two abstract objects could be arithmetically summed? Because that could be an argument for maybe the incoherence of taking two Platonic forms. What it would mean to sum two things?
I've wondered about this too, Rich. I mean, what in the world does it mean to say 2 plus 2? And I think here probably the best bet would be structuralism, a view of mathematics to which many philosophers of mathematics are today attracted. And on this view, numbers are not objects, rather they are positions in an abstract structure. So if you take the position in the abstract structure that is 2 and you double it, well, then it will be a different position in the structure that's called 4. And that's what it means to say 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's different positions in this abstract structure.
Okay.
And this is interesting because there are both ontologically heavy versions of structuralism, and then there are so-called eliminative structuralists who are anti-realists about the structures and just think of these as mental.
Yeah.
Here's another question on the board for any of us. For communication to occur, it seems that a speaker makes a meaningful assertion and the audience understands the same meaning. How does that occur? It seems to assume there is something, a shared meaning that both speaker and audience access. But that makes it sound as if there's a real meaning, independent of the assertion itself. Can that be so if nominalism is true?
Well, this is your question about meaning again, which I haven't spent any time on at all. I'm inclined to say that you can adopt a linguistic framework in which you can talk about meaning but that doesn't commit you ontologically to there being actual objects called meaning. It's just to say that what you mean in asserting S, I mean